Hello, everybody. It's so nice to have you with us today. I'm Norma Levy. I'm the founder and president of New Plaza Cinema, and we are a nonprofit cinema. And today we are looking forward to a very lively discussion about the fascinating 1973 thriller film, Don't Look Back. And now I'm pleased to introduce our host for this talkback, the noted author and film historian, Max Alvarez. Max?
Thank you, Norma. And for the Bob Dylan fans out there, I don't want you to feel disappointed because actually the film we're talking about is Don't Look Now. Don't Look Back is a really cool documentary about Bob Dylan.
Oh, thank you, Max.
I think your Bob Dylan feelings are coming out, Norma. No, that's terrific. Great to see everyone. Gary Palmucci normally would be joining us today, but it's good news. He's so busy at our 35 West 67th Street Cinema in Macaulay College, overseeing the very successful run of the Bill Nye drama Living, that his time, unfortunately, is limited for us this afternoon, but he's definitely here in spirit. I will, however, have joining me today our cinematography expert and filmmaker, Daniel Cahill. This is a great favorite of his, this 1973 Nicholas Roeg film. We, on Wednesday for New Plaza, gave a presentation on the year 1973, which is a quite remarkable year because it was a time when films like this were getting distributed by major studios. Paramount Pictures may not have underwritten the entire budget of this most unusual chiller, but they did distribute it in the United States. And it's hard to imagine the studio doing that 10 years later or several years after that. This was very indicative of a time when the auteurs were being taken seriously, and auteurist cinema was of great interest to a Hollywood that wasn't quite sure where the audience had gone. And then in 1973, they were rediscovering the mass audience, or the mass audience was rediscovering the cinema with films like The Sting and The Way We Were and Paper Moon and others. But this is most certainly a very edgy and independent type film being produced in England. We have Donald Sutherland 3 years after Robert Altman's MASH. We have Julie Christie 2 years after Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and 2 years before Hal Ashby's Warren Beatty film Shampoo. Making a film that it's difficult to imagine how this would have even appeared in the screenplay stage. It is so unusually structured. And I know Dan, and I'll contribute as well to some thoughts on the most unusual questions about the film. Somebody has already indicated a question about the censorship of the film. How did the censorships allow, or the censors allow the lovemaking scene? I wish Gary was here to give specifics, but I do recall that when Don't Look Now was reviewed in Variety, the critic praised the very beautifully done lovemaking scene, and there was an editorial insert in the review indicating that Paramount was going to be making some trims for the United States in order for the film to get an R rating. Dan can maybe shed some details on if the current version that's available is similar to what was originally shown in this country. But now let's begin by getting a sense as to how Paramount sold this most unusual Nicholas Roeg film. The third feature film by this former cinematographer. Dan will tell us more about Roeg's background as a DP. He had already directed Mick Jagger in Performance around 1969. And then 2 years before Don't Look Now, he directed another very unsettling drama set in the Australian outback, Walkabout. This was the next film that Roeg made, his third feature.
a psychic.
She wants you to know. I've seen her. And she wants you to know that she's happy.
Christine.
John, do you hear what I say? It was Christine.
My daughter is dead, Laura. She does not come peeping with messages back from behind the grave.
Yes.
Christine is dead.
Yes.
She is dead.
Yes.
Dead, 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 dead.
What is it, Mr. Baxter? What is it you fear?
My wife was warned that I was in danger.
What did she say? Oh,
Laura!
please, fetch him back. Let him not go. Fetch him. Fetch him. Fetch him.
I hope it's not another murder. I will pray for you.
I'm such a broken record. I think I say this every time we have a talk back. I love the fact that this is a trailer that tells us the title of the movie several times. They don't just wait to the very end to tell us what the name of the film is, which they expect us today to have a photographic memory. But it certainly does establish the tone of Don't Look Now, from the tension and the terror of the narrative to the very unusual editing structure, which is something that Nicholas Roeg is going to continue well into the 1980s in films such as The Man Who Fell to Earth with David Bowie, and Eureka with Gene Hackman, and even Insignificance with his wife, Teresa Russell, which came out in the 1980s. This idea of jumping back and forth in time, flash forward, flash back, in a narrative that, when the films first came out, would have been very puzzling to many moviegoers, but we are so used to that today with limited series and streaming series that begin at the end and then jump to the middle and then go back to the beginning and then go to the end, although usually they have titles telling us where we are. Whereas Don't Look Now has no fears about baffling us. We have the tragedy of the daughters drowning in the beginning, and then we join the couple a while later in Venice, but then we jump back earlier to when they were back at home with their family, and there's no signage or titles telling us that we are now back. Roeg and his editor are assuming that we, the moviegoers, are smart enough to build the narrative together. One thing, before I bring Dan in, and I'd love to hear Dan talk about this when he and I have a discussion, is there have been cases where cinematographers, the ones responsible for lighting a movie, and in the case of European and international production, operating the camera, make the switch from photography to directing. So Nicholas Roeg was not the only one to do this, but he was one of the very few cinematographers who was able to transition from cinematography to art intellectual cinema. For reasons which someone needs to investigate further, many cinematographers tended to end up, when they directed films, making genre pictures, thrillers, horror movies, low-budget type pictures. I don't know why that is. Maybe Dan will have some theories on that. In any event, I think Dan Cahill needs to be brought in because Don't Look Now is a very important film to Dan. He's going to tell us about the film, about its literary origins, and I know he's going to bring some insight into this haunting and unsettling Nicholas Roeg film from 50 years ago. Welcome back, Dan.
Thank you, Max. There is a lot to cover here, and I'm going to begin with my usual video tour through the film, visual tour through the film. I'm going to activate and share my screen. Let's hope it all works this time. Yes, there we are. This is the title card for the film, and after my presentation, I'm going to discuss why there are quotation marks around the title, something we never really ever see in a film. But instead, before I even go into many of the visuals, I want to talk about the director, Nicholas Roeg. As Max has referred, he began not just as a cinematographer, but he began as an assistant on the film crew. There is a legendary name in British cinematography, that being Freddie Young. And Freddie shot 3 of the big epics for David Lean, specifically going in reverse order, Ryan's Daughter, Dr. Zhivago, and the preceding epic, Lawrence of Arabia. And Nicholas Roeg was credited as second unit director, which means he spent a lot of time in the desert with camels. And then he moved from second unit work to being a director of photography. And here are some of the films that he shot only, not directed. There is Petulia, sort of a psychedelic tour of San Francisco, I believe, starring Julie Christie. We have Far from the Madding Crowd, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and Francois Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451. So Mr. Roeg was getting experience working with directors who kind of pushed the envelope a little bit. Here we see a shot of him directing, not sure what that was. Here we see him behind one of the longest lenses imaginable. He was an active camera operator, as will be evidenced by, this is probably my favorite picture of Mr. Roeg. He is indeed operating a camera with one eye at the eyepiece, as cameras of that day required. But one thing, as I learned also when I was operating a camera, you learn to leave your other eye open so you can see what's just beyond the frame and anticipate things that are coming at the frame. So this is a very revealing shot of Nick Roeg. Let's see, Max already mentioned the other films that he worked on. I would cite 3 more. One is another disturbing drama called Bad Timing, A Sensual Obsession, which stars yet another male singer, Art Garfunkel. And he did 2 adaptations of noted works for television, one being Sweet Bird of Youth and the other being Heart of Darkness, which starred John Malkovich. So here we are. Let's plunge into the visuals of Don't Look Now. This is actually the first shot of the film. And people don't remember this white horse. What is a horse doing in this movie? It's not a Western. Well, my only explanation for why the horse is there thematically is that it adds almost a mythic element to this playground that the doomed Christine has in front of her. You almost expect to see a unicorn popping out of the horse's head. But I will say it's not intended to be entirely fantasy, because on the soundtrack, you can hear the horses neighing or whinnying. Another element, and I'm going to deal with a lot of elements visually that recur frequently throughout the film, and breaking glass is one of them. Here, Christine's little brother, Johnny, big brother probably, Johnny, runs his bike over a pane of glass, and it shatters. And we will see more broken glass to come. Now, I'm going to move beyond Christine's death, which is troubling enough to watch, but I want to move to the next scene of the film, which takes place in Venice in a cafe where John Baxter and Laura Baxter, Mr. Sutherland and Miss Christie, are dining. And the two old ladies who have been watching them get up and go to the restroom to clear some cinder from Wendy's eye, she being the sighted one, Heather being the blind one. And as they pass by, there is a close-up of a brooch on Wendy's sweater. We will see this brooch again. The scene in the bathroom as Julie is meeting the two sisters is fascinating for Roeg's use of mirrors. Now, mirrors are a constant matter of fascination for me and a lot of filmmakers. I just want to point out, this is not easy to get these three mirrors aligned so that we see three different angles on Heather's face, not to mention the inquisitive look on Julie Christie's face. This is a triumph of performance and camera placement. Here we see another interesting camera issue, that Julie Christie is learning about what Wendy claims to have seen. And you get to see two takes on her face in one frame. This is very efficient stuff. Once again, they do it with mirrors. While Laura is in the restroom, John is looking out the window of the cafe to see what Anthony Richmond, the director of photography, calls light dancing on the water. And here is yet another closer shot in the same take of light dancing on the water, a motif that you will see a lot of if you're in Venice when you're lucky enough to have sunshine. This is the iconic photograph in a slide that John was looking at when he sensed that his daughter was in trouble outside. And he's looking at the slide now, and he sees this mysterious red hooded figure sitting there in the church. And you can see by the thumb at the left that he's holding this slide in front of him. And then the camera pulls back from it, and we see the cafe. And Laura is returning from the restroom, and this is what happens. She is so upset by what she has learned that she faints at the table and tumbles. I'm not sure if it was actually filmed in slow motion or not, but it's an unusually photographed episode where she crashes the table around her. Turns out she's okay. Later, they go out into Venice, and Laura wants to light a candle in the church. The discussion with Wendy and Heather has stimulated her to make a prayerful gesture. And again, the title Candle in the Wind struck me here. Now, signs are important in this film, background elements. And this comes right after John has been in the church that he's restoring, and he has come out and told the bishop that the problem in the church is that the acidity in the air is destroying some of the mosaics. And sure enough, we see a sign here, Venice in peril. Well, Venice has been in peril for a long time, and global climate change is not helping. But I take this as a genuine sign that they simply captured without creating it for the film. This is one of the beginning shots of the famous love scene between John and Laura. And the thing that I find fascinating and endearing about the love scene is how casual this couple is with themselves. Nudity is no big deal. They're kind of hanging out, and it makes it far more real and quotidian, if you will. This is the loving part of it, and I don't have to go into detail on it, although I strongly suspect that there was very little censorship going on before the American release. Famously, the BBC cut the entire love scene before they aired it on TV. I suspect that standard has changed now, that this sort of thing, which doesn't really show anything terribly dangerous on screen, it suggests it, but it does not depict it. And I did read that I believe Roeg had to cut something like 7 frames from it in order to bypass the censors. I could not tell you what those frames are. But here's the unique aspect of this love scene, and you will all remember this, is that it's intercut with the after part of the love scene as they're getting dressed. Here, Laura is pulling on her trousers. She's buttoning her sweater while John is tying his tie. She's applying makeup. And the best part of any afterglow is the happy couple strolling out to dinner, arm in arm. And it would almost seem like they have destroyed the curse of their daughter's death. At least it's going to be a happy evening, we imagine, despite the lurking presence of the hotel manager almost begging them to eat dinner at the hotel, which is closed for the winter. I'm inserting a couple of things here that don't have much to do with the narrative, but as I looked at, this is the house where John and Laura were staying in England when Christine died. And I just looked at it twice and thought, this is a really strange looking building. On the right, it looks like it's covered in wooden planks. The left, it's a little hard to see, but it looks like masonry, all covered by a single roof. And all I can think is Nicholas Roeg was location scouting. He saw this and said, yeah, let's shoot there. Another sort of anomalous scene inserted in the narrative is the two sisters laughing hilariously as they've been looking at the family pictures that are on the dresser in their pension. Why? I don't know. Once again, Mr. Roeg loves to provoke us and get us thinking strange thoughts, especially about these two people who are indeed very strange. This is Laura's departure by Vaporetto from the dock. She's heading to the airport eventually. And I included this just because it's lovely. And once again, we see some, oops, that's right. Here's the wide shot of the light dancing on the surface of the water. And it never hurts to see seagulls flapping around. Beautiful shot. Now we're going to move into the sequence with the scaffolding in the church. And this is a very close shot of John testing out some replacement tiles that the bishop has brought to him. And obviously it's a close shot of this mosaic that he's trying to repair. And then we see this. Now this is actually the second shot of this wooden rail starting to fall. The previous shot was so fast, I had an almost impossible time trying to capture it. So I went with this one, which lasts maybe a half second longer. The net effect of this on the audience is to think to themselves, wait, did I just see something? What was that? Is something going to happen? And all this transpires in maybe 3 or 4 seconds that we glimpse these foreshadowings. And this is kind of what the movie is all about. Thinking you saw something that may foretell the future, may not. But it's followed here by the wooden rail on the upper right is crashing through a pane of glass that is attached to John's scaffolding. And you can see John bent over at the bottom of the frame in the center. And then all hell breaks loose. The scaffolding collapses and John is left dangling. Now, the story is that the local Italian stuntman who was called in to do this refused because the insurance coverage was not sufficient to cover his family. That's the story that the crew tells. And Sutherland said, okay, I'll do it. And if you need any extra proof, there he is dangling on the rope as they're trying to push him back towards the brink that he wants to be on. Incidentally, Sutherland in an interview said he had no vertigo while shooting this scene. Why? Because it wasn't Donald Sutherland on the rope, it was John Baxter, his character, and he could persuade himself that Baxter wouldn't feel vertigo. This is a marvelous shield that a lot of actors can put up between their own character and the character they're portraying. And one of the final shots in this sequence is of the powerful bishop walking out of the cathedral, church, whatever it is, basilica, I'm not sure. And he steps on one of these new tiles that is being used to restore the church, indicative of his indifference about the project that John is working on. Now, I showed you the Venice in Peril sign. This is John conversing with the bishop, and behind them is a Charlie Chaplin poster, which says the text at the bottom is revealed as "one against all" in Italian. Somehow I think it's fitting that there being a Charlie Chaplin poster after a massive bit of stunt work. This is John's very brief glimpse of Laura with the two sisters on a boat. He's not quite sure what he's seen, but he knows it's his wife. And he eventually winds up in a police station talking to this inspector, whom I, in a very familiar way, have dubbed Inspector Lampshade. Why anyone would put a lampshade in the way of his seeing the people who come into his office is a mystery to me. But Rogue loves mysteries, and this guy has to swivel in his chair to see who has come into his office. John escorts the two ladies, or sorry, not the two ladies. He escorts Wendy, the psychic one, back to their hotel after the police station. And this is just a fascinating bit of dialogue. She says to him, they're talking about Venice at night, and she says to John, Milton loved this city. Well, Milton is not Milton Berle. No, they're talking about John Milton, the famous poet, author, who wrote Paradise Lost, among other things. And he was famously, like Wendy, blind, and he loved Venice. Now we're in the sisters' hotel room. This is a different hotel room, and there is an object lying on the dresser on the left side. It's a little hard to make it out, but then we get a close-up in John's hand. It is the brooch that Wendy, the sighted sister, was wearing in the cafe. It appears to me to be a mermaid vainly holding a mirror up to its face. I am not an expert on Venetian art and culture or on jewelry, so if anybody in our audience has any theory about what this might signify, it might mean simply that they're living in a town which is half water, and a mermaid would seem to be an important denizen of that town. Not sure. We're nearing the climax now, and this is the often seen shot of the small character, excuse me, of the small character, this time reflected upside down in the canal as she is trying to escape. Here she is. This is our favorite dwarf Italian actress. The actress's name is Adelina Poerio, and she had one other role, albeit uncredited. A couple of years earlier, she played a nun in Federico Fellini's The Clowns. And I also read that she had something of a career as a singer. That's all I know about her. I'm imagining from her evident age 50 years ago that she is probably no longer with us, but I do not know. This is a hard shot to see, but it comes with one of the recurring visual motifs. This is as John is dying. There is a frame you see in the bottom part, and above that is a crescent-shaped window. And John's feet are at the window, and as he is going through his death throes, his feet kick out the window, and that is a pane of glass in the center falling down. Here we are near the climax. After John has died, we see what it was that John glimpsed, which was his own funeral boat. And we see it along with some majestic music. And we also get a chance to look at the enigmatic, yes, Mona Lisa smile on Julie Christie's face. Now, Nicholas Roeg apparently offered two explanations for why he directed it this way. One is that I want to bring you back to a few moments earlier as she was trying to reach through the gate that John had closed behind him in order to protect what he thought was the little girl he was trying to save. And she reaches through and she screams, "My darlings," thinking that it was John and her daughter Christine who were on the other side of the gate. And Rogue says she probably was thinking that her darlings are safe together in heaven now. The other explanation Rogue offered is that maybe she thinks she's pregnant, which is a nice thought to carry away from the film. This is the last shot in the film, and it's the arrival of the funeral boat at a church where the funeral is going to be. And for some unexplained reason, Wendy, the psychic blind woman, is the last to leave the boat and come up the steps. And she has a sort of a hard time, nearly stumbling. So Heather comes back to help her. This is a moment that the editor, Graham Clifford, loved and wanted in the film. And he apparently got a lot of his way. He was behind the suggestion of showing the different time frames during the love scene. Graham Clifford, who later became a director on his own. I could not let the movie, my talk finish here without recognizing this man. His name is Pino Donaggio, and he is the composer of the soundtrack music. He is Venetian, and the way he got the job was he had a random encounter with one of the producers of the film, and they got to know him and offered him the job of composing his first film score. He has gone on to later film scores. Most significantly for us to know, he composed 2 films for Brian De Palma, specifically Carrie and Dressed to Kill. Couple of last things here. I just had to show this, and I want to acknowledge the folks at the Criterion Collection who have a marvelous DVD edition of this film, along with a full second disc of extras, including this interview with Rogue from about 20 years ago. And they placed him in an empty church, very appropriately. And then also very appropriately, towards the end of the interview with him, suddenly he's not alone in the church anymore. I don't know who came up with this, but it's kind of clever, and you have to wink and move on. Lastly, I want to show you, this is the fabled, legendary Daphne du Maurier. And she was the source of many important film stories. I'm going to stop the share now because that's the last image I have. Max, feel free to rejoin me, please. Mrs. du Maurier was an author of very good stories. She was a master storyteller, but she was kind of not fully appreciated by the literary establishment because she wrote best-selling books like Rebecca, adapted by Hitchcock, and Jamaica Inn, adapted by Hitchcock, and the story The Birds, also adapted by Hitchcock. And here we go, she's still going strong. There are other films, Frenchman's Creek and The Scapegoat, and they're all interesting up to a point. But anyway, you got to acknowledge Daphne du Maurier and her influence on cinema. And I will talk for a minute about the story, the original story that she wrote, which is available, it's in print in this edition of Don't Look Now, Selected Stories selected and with an introduction by Patrick McGrath. This is the current edition that's in print. And let's go back to those quotation marks. The very first sentence is a quote from John to his wife saying, quote, "Don't look now," John said to his wife, "but there are a couple of old girls 2 tables away who are trying to hypnotize me," unquote. So that's how the story begins. And I like to think it was out of respect for the original story that they put the quotes around the title. Although it's curious that for a British film, when the Brits print quotation marks, they're always what they call inverted commas, like apostrophes for us. They're not the double marks that we use. I don't know. It's a mystery lost in the mists of time. But I do want to pay some homage to Alan Scott and Chris Bryant, who were the 2 adapters of this 50-page story. And in the original story, Christine died of meningitis. Nothing as spectacular as the drowning. And John and Laura are simply visiting Venice as tourists, trying to get away from their crisis. And all they're doing is just they're tourists visiting various churches. And imagine all the richness that was added into this film. The red coat in the film was not worn by the murdering dwarf. It was worn by Laura. When he sees her on the funeral boat, she's wearing a red coat. That signifies Laura to him. But they lifted that and used it in a far more consequential way that haunts everyone who has seen the film. I will never forget when my ex-wife bought a little shiny red Mac for my 4-year or 5-year-old daughter. We had a good laugh over it before we freaked out, but it's one of those things you don't ever forget. But imagine this story without John's having a professional purpose to be interested in the culture and society of Venice. It would be extremely shallow. Yes, Max.
And I'm curious, in the Du Maurier story, did you have a series of killings taking place in Venice as appeared in the film?
It's very submerged in the background. There's no scene with a police inspector. There's no evidence of pulling a woman's body out of the canal, but it's referenced mildly. And it comes up when he is trying to find where Laura is, and he contacts the police, as he does in the film, claiming that he's seen his wife, who should be in England. And that's how it comes up, that there are crimes going on. But I will say, the last line in the story is also a quotation. It's John's thinking. Now, in the movie, he sort of does what dying people are supposed to do, which is have a retrospective of his life or what we know of it. But in the story, he's thinking to himself, what a bloody, silly way to die.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's not a light touch of irony there, but a rather slam bang punch in the gut that this is all he's thinking as he's keeling over.
I would be so curious to see what the screenplay looked like, because I've talked about this before. They're very hard to locate original scripts, but I would imagine that a lot of the moving around in time, flash forward, flashbacks, maybe a lot of that came out during the editing stage, or was it scripted that way? I suspect it was something that came out as they were assembling the picture after they filmed it.
Well, in this marvelous Criterion collection, and I want to pay homage and thanks to them for all their hard work, there is about an hour-long interview with Graham Clifford, the editor, and it's conducted by a woman named Bobby Osteen, who is the ex-wife of Sam Osteen, the editor of Chinatown. Mm-hmm. But anyway, moving on, he talks about a lot of the editing structure that he proposed to Rogue and that they agreed on, and they together worked on it and embellished it. And the reason that Mr. Clifford got the editing job was that he was an assistant director with Robert Altman on McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And he got to know Julie Christie, who said, well, I'm on my way to England soon to film this wonderful film with Nicholas Roeg. You should come along and edit the picture. And that's exactly what happened. No mention of agents getting involved or any of that normal stuff. So he's a good interview if you get a chance to hear him.
Before I rewatched it, Dan, you did mention the appearance of the white horse early on. And when I sat and watched it again this week, I was actually reminded of the Georges Franju film Thomas the Imposter from 1965, which has a very harrowing moment taking place during war of a white horse stampeding through a town, and the horse's mane is on fire. And that was such a legendary image in international cinema in the 1960s. Costa Gavras referenced that in his 1982 film Missing, which takes place during the coup d'etat in 1973 in Chile, where you see a horse stampeding through the streets.
A flaming
of
horse. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if perhaps Roeg was referencing Thomas the Imposter in a way. It's just a thought that I had when I was watching it.
It could easily be. I'm familiar with Franju's work, like Eyes Without a Face, some of
yeah.
those others, but I don't know Thomas the Imposter. So you're sharing this with me and enlightening me.
Cool.
Anybody out there who knows any other flaming horses, please call
Please
them
let us
to our
know.
attention.
I tracked down the original Variety review of the film from 1973. They were reviewing it from London, and the critic was praising the editing. He said, "The editing too is careful and painstaking." He said, "The classically brilliant and erotic lovemaking scene, which helped get the picture a British X rating and is reportedly to be cut by Paramount in the US, is merely one of several examples." I also remember there was an accompanying article that they were planning to make some changes to the scene, but they don't appear to have done much to it here in the States.
Well,
Unless you noticed, did something jump out at you from the original?
no,
Right.
this looks pretty much like the version I've always seen, which is the Paramount distributed version that made its way intact into the DVD. I will share some interesting thoughts from Donald Sutherland, who said, first of all, Rogue assured them that nothing really obscene would be visible in the film. And that's kind of true. You get to see her breasts and their buttocks, but that was pretty much standard fare in a lot of cinema in the early 70s. The notion that real lovemaking occurred during this scene, Sutherland just said, forget about it. That didn't happen. And I'll tell you why. They shot this in a rented hotel room that they rented anonymously in Venice. They sneaked their handheld cameras in under their coats. The hotel had no idea what they were doing there. And you can kind of tell the lighting is fairly dim. So they did not have any extra lighting brought in for that. He said he had known Julie Christie for an hour and a half before they started filming. And the first thing they did was take their clothes off and stand around naked talking about the scene. And he described a typical scene, a take from the scene being Rogue saying, Julie, darling, would you turn your head to the left a bit? Right. And now could you touch Donald's shoulder? No, the other shoulder. That's right, darling. Okay, let's roll it. And then they would roll this 35 millimeter, very loud camera designed never to be used when recording live sound, as they did not do in this scene. And it sounds kind of like a lawnmower. Sutherland kind of went, rah, as he was trying to describe it. I won't go any further with that, but there isn't a skosh of anything romantic going on in that room. It looks very, very, very good on screen. That's what happens when you get a talented crew and two wonderful star actors.
And the magic of editing, putting images together.
And again, if they hadn't included that daily life stuff of them getting ready to go out to dinner afterwards, I mean, anybody who's had a lover knows that feeling that, they call it afterglow. You've solved all the problems of the world and you're ready to go out and have an exquisite meal.
Well, in this day where sensuality and eroticism have virtually disappeared from cinema, it seems, independent cinema, you have to give Nicholas Roeg credit because he was never afraid of dealing with sexuality in his films. I mean, Performance got an X rating. Don't Look Now got an X rating in the UK. Bad Timing got an X rating when it came out here.
Oh, yeah.
The Man Who Fell to Earth had some very erotic scenes between Candy Clark and David Bowie, also had to be trimmed in the US. So he never shied away from erotic imagery. And you have
Roeg was a pioneer. He was a risk taker. There's even full frontal nudity in Walkabout. Now, it's all very innocent. It's young people swimming and enjoying themselves in the outback, but it's there. And if you're a prude, you're going to find it and complain about it probably. And I can't say all of his films are wonderful. Some of his later films are kind of problematic and not that interesting, but he earned my respect early on and he has retained it forever.
Well, this is certainly a fascinating picture that developed really more of a cult following in the years after it was released, it seemed.
Oh, yeah.
And Do you have any theories, Dan, about what I was discussing briefly about cinematographers who turn director? It's very rare to see a DP go on to make a Ben-Hur or a Star Wars or an epic. They often do smaller, almost genre type pictures. And I'm thinking of Gordon Willis made the thriller Windows.
Which he
James Wan Howe
rewound.
directed the Harlem Globetrotters and Go Man Go. I mean, these were small pictures. And yet
Well,
Rogue went to a more artier. He was one of the few who was able to have more of an artier track.
yeah, but then again, look at the directors that Rogue shot for. Let's start with David Lean. Oh God, who was the guy who directed Petulia and a funny
Oh,
thing?
Richard Lester.
Lester, thank you. I knew it was Richard.
And
somebody.
Fahrenheit 451, he photographed
Truffaut. So he was used to, and I'm going to say this is something I learned in the first semester of film school, is that the DP has to be the director's best friend. Okay? I'm leaving the actors out of it for the moment, but amongst the crew, it's the director and DP who are the ones who are really crafting the film. And he got to work on a very close basis with these influential and pioneering directors. And I don't think he was going to settle for doing a film about basketball. I think he had his goals. And here's my little joke for today. He worked with camels a lot in Lawrence of Arabia. And on performance, his co-director was a Brit named Donald Camel. Just had to offer that. We can move on quickly.
Who later went on to direct Julie Christie in Demon Seed.
Yes.
Brace yourself, Dan. I'm about to be brilliant. This doesn't happen often.
Yes.
When you mentioned Petulia, which Rogue shot for Richard Lester in 1968, that had an editing style that's very similar to the editing style that Rogue developed throughout his career. Backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards. The audience has to piece together the narrative. And Julie Christie was in that picture as well.
I'm
wondering if that had an influence on him as well.
No, if some kind person, while we're chatting away, would go to IMDb and look up who was the editor of Petulia, wouldn't it be interesting if it was Graham Clifford? I doubt that it was, but anything's possible here. So if anybody wants to chime in on chat or Q&A and let us know, I hate to tear myself away from the camera here and look these things up, but you're right. Petulia is kind of a psychedelic looking film. I think it was meant to capitalize on that drug crazed era. But if it set the tone or set the pattern or template for Don't Look Now, then I'm grateful to it. And performance also had some weird editing too, as I recall.
And the editors, someone mentions it was Anthony Gibbs. Thank you so much, Barbara, for pointing that out. Anthony Gibbs. Performance, of course, had unusual editing. Let us now open things up to questions or comments from our viewing audience. Lori can assist us with that. And I'm just also reiterating a reminder that on Wednesday, the 25th, I will be back to give a presentation online at 3:00 Eastern Time when filming in Rome, which is part of the Cinema in the Series program where we discuss how cities are portrayed in motion pictures. And I'll be talking about Rome, particularly in the 50s and the 60s and in the 70s. And then 2 weeks from today, we will be talking about 2 weeks in another town. Filmed in Rome by Vincent Minnelli with Kirk Douglas and Edward G. Robinson from 1962. So that will be our next talk back.
What do you take of all the broken glass? There's a lot of broken glass in this movie.
It's hard to come up with anything that broken glass represents other than chaos, maybe, dismantling of norms. But when you pause and think about what you see in churches, are stained glass windows with a lot of broken pieces of glass assembled. That just occurred to me, by the way. I really don't know that I can.
I don't know if I bought that, but okay.
I'm reaching for something, but
I just thought it was interesting because it's kind of like in your face throughout the entire movie, the theme of broken glass from like the very beginning, you know.
Yep.
And,
they
and
won't
I,
let you
I
finish.
actually, I had a question, just one question myself, Dan, about the music, and maybe Laurie has some thoughts, but the Pino Donaggio music during the chilling ending, as Donald Sutherland is lying there bleeding to death, the music has a melancholy, sweet feel. It's not your hammer horror, screeching violins approach. Any thoughts on that?
Well,
choice of
there
music?
is some true horror music when he first gets stabbed.
Mm.
Yeah.
But then as he's reliving his life or his recent life, the movie gets a lot more melodic. And I just have to point out for any of you who are interested, there is a CD of the soundtrack music, which I've owned for a long time. It may be a little hard to find. Just a few days ago, I went on Amazon and discovered that they have only one left in stock. So hurry and order it. But I'm sure you can find a used copy somewhere online. It's a lovely 30-minute CD of the soundtrack music.
All right. Well, just to remind everyone, if you have a question, please go to the reaction button and raise your hand. And I see that Marianne, our lovely Marianne, has her hand up. Marianne?
Yes. I
Hi.
have two. Hi, guys. I have two questions. First of all, when we were preparing, you said that it was for you a masterpiece.
Yes.
I would like you to elaborate a little bit about that. And the second question is a question that's also in the chat. Why was he killed?
Mm.
Well, okay.
Can I address that a sec? Because I thought
Go
about
ahead.
that a lot. I think it's almost like a MacGuffin, his death. It's like what drives the whole movie at some point. Because like when he falls from the rafter thing, when he's putting the mosaic tile, I think everyone thinks that's where he's going to die. So it's almost like this recurring thing. Like, is this where he's going to die? Is this where he's going to die? So I think it's a bit of a MacGuffin, and then, he dies, and then we see that what he indeed saw was, his second sight of again, making it up.
Well, if one wants to draw a political interpretation, it's that he's being punished for not buying into the fact that the dead daughter is trying to communicate with him, and maybe he's being punished for that.
This is his tragic flaw, is that he doesn't know he has the gift. And this is in the dialogue between the sisters. Wendy, the blind one, says he has the gift and he doesn't know it.
Yeah.
And he is so rigidly rational. He can't accept the fact that someone could see his dead daughter.
But Julie Christie kind of buys it, because at one point she says that he started running out of the house before the son even started screaming for them.
Yeah.
So, looking at the slide and he saw the blood.
Right. I mean, he knows something is up, but he is too rational to be able to understand it or interpret it. And this is the tragedy of the film. It's a tragic film.
Yeah.
He dies because he has seen the consequence of his death before he dies. He's seen the funeral barge with his wife on it, his widow. And this all links together. Now, back to the masterpiece question. Well, first of all, I consider Rogue to be a master director, and this is his best film. It's the most resonant one. It's the one that I can watch. I think I've seen this film probably close to 10 times.
Wow.
And every time I think I see something I hadn't seen before. So all of you who just watched it for the first time, Laurie and Marianne, watch it again. Give it a week or two, but watch it again and you will see stuff. Maybe stuff that I highlighted today, but there's a lot in it. It is packed with detail.
Well, the color red plays a big part too. Julie Christie wears red boots, and then what do you also make of the upside down imagery?
Oh, I think it's just interesting. It's another way to depict how strange that world is. I also love the long shots looking down a long street and you see the tiny little red-coated figure cross a doorway.
Which reminds me, Dan, because you had indicated the other day when we were talking that you believe Spielberg referenced that for Schindler's List. Is that?
Well, yes, there is the critical scene with the little girl in the red raincoat when everything else is in black and white. And he must have, look, Spielberg knows his movies, and he knows and remembers the red raincoat from 20 years earlier. So I'm sure he was aware of it, and I'm sure his colleagues went, "Oh, going a little rogue on us, eh?" So, yeah, I think it's there, and I think it's fair to comment about it.
We have a question from Russell. Russell, can you unmute and start your video?
Yes, good afternoon. I had a comment and a question. The comment was on the laughter by the sister who, in the to me, especially seeing that in trailer, it just added a very chilling note. It almost seemed like a maniacal laughter. It reminded me sort of like a Betty Davis in what was it, Baby Jane, or one of those. It was that kind of thing that just sort of added a little level of malevolence to the atmosphere. And I thought it was a pretty dynamic, pretty dramatic moment for me anyway.
Yes, indeed.
And then my question was, I had heard read on one of the reviews, they said that Rogue really liked using the zoom lens. He liked zooming in, and that was very unusual. It says directors usually do not use a zoom lens. I wondered if you could comment on the use in this film, and is that truly something that most directors do not use? Thank you.
Well, yes, I'm happy to talk about that because it's the kind of thing I notice. Zooms were very popular during the 60s, and you will notice that frequently, that it was a new toy. And the reason why zooms fell out of favor, in my interpretation, is that they are a very artificial way of portraying something. The zoom is something that the human eye cannot do. The human eye can imagine cutting from a wide image to a closer image. We can do that on our brains, but a zoom is very artificial. And I think that's why they fell out of favor. Now, what's interesting is that Rogue uses them in very, very subtle ways. One way to mask a zoom is to pan the camera as you're doing it, or tilt the camera, whatever you're doing. And he does that very effortlessly. But you're right, there are zooms here far more than most other directors in that era would have used.
It's thank you, Dan. It's a tool that in the wrong hands can drive an audience to the point of madness because it was so misused in so many genre pictures. But Rogue obviously does it very masterfully here. Luchino Visconti was known for his masterful use of the zoom lens in films such as Death in Venice, which was Death in Venice. There's the Venice theme again, 2 years earlier. He also used the zoom powerfully. It starts to fall out of favor as the 70s move on. Rogue was still using it. I know in the 80s he was using it, and it seemed a little retro looking by the 80s when he was using it, but obviously it was a technique that he found favor with.
Saying that, I did not notice any zoom. I'll have to go back and look at the film again, but I wondered if you could just maybe come up with one area or one time where you remember him using the zoom lens. If I go back and watch it, I can pick up on it.
Yes, I even quoted from it. The shot where, from John's point of view, he's looking out through the window of the cafe, and that's the first time I talked about the light dancing on the water. It begins with a wide shot, and then it zooms in. So you're looking through a piece of the fence, I think, at the same water. And yes, it's a zoom, but it's so artfully done that it doesn't really turn you off. Watch it again and you'll find it there. And if you're really alert, you will find numerous other zoom shots in the film, artfully displayed.
A way to tell a difference between a zoom and a dolly shot is a dolly shot can keep focus throughout and you'll have a depth of field. Whereas when you go for a zoom, the farther out on the zoom, the more telephoto you get, the more compressed the image is. It's a very different, because people think dolly shots and zooms are the same, and
they're not
at all.
You lose depth of field.
One is physically moving.
It's not a new tool.
Focus when you zoom in on something. As Lori just said, it goes telephoto on you, so the focus is very shallow, and it sort of separates the object from the foreground and background. And that's an artificial look.
Yeah.
And it was a technique that was available to filmmakers from the late 20s. There were a couple of silent films. There was, It with Clara Bow in the late 20s that used a zoom, but it was very sparingly used during the old Hollywood system.
Well, there's the famous Vertigo shot looking down the tower where, and I always get this
Push-pull.
backwards, where he was either dollying in and zooming back or just the opposite. It's almost hard to discern which, but Hitchcock knew how to use it by disguising it with moving the camera at the same time.
And then Spike Lee sort of does a modified version of that with putting his characters on the dollies and like moving with them. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I hate that. I hate that.
Yeah.
Hate
Such
it.
a buzzkill, Lori. We were having such a nice time.
Oh, and I hope you said Spike Lee and not Mike Lee. Am I right?
Oh, yes, Mike.
Good.
I have one more question. It has to do, Dan and Laura, you can chime in as well. The extraordinary uses of Venice as a location, because it's so extraordinary, the location photography. And the first thing we notice is the city is empty. How did they do that? How did they get away with that? Any insight into that? I've never been to Venice, but
I have an answer. And this is a good way to sign off. If there are more questions, I'm happy to take them. But this is an entry from October 19th of 2004 in my travel diary. Janet and I went to a highly recommended seafood restaurant called Da Franz, which is still open. And I write, Da Franz is indeed excellent. The atmosphere is very nice and the service superb. Walking home around 10, the streets are completely deserted. A little bit of Don't Look Now ambience. A light fog enhances things considerably. So, I had insisted on Janet seeing Don't Look Now before we went to Venice. And
was that wise, really?
I think it enhanced it all. I mean,
yeah.
We got over the horror of the film, and I think I convinced her of the mastery and beauty of the film.
Well, to me, and I didn't really lose the screen direction, but I don't think it was in continuity. It was very jarring. And usually in a scene, if you see one person going this way and one's pursuing one, then the next scene you see the other person going the same direction. And it was totally convoluted, but yet you still believed that he was being followed by this cop,
Well, it's supposed to be convoluted and confusing.
Correct.
And everybody who has been to Venice gets lost at least once. Okay. I know this from old cities in Morocco also, where you've got medieval street grids and it's very easy to lose your way. So indeed, I'm sure that was intentional. Go ahead.
So the other thing I thought about was the shot when they're pulling the woman's body out of the water. Did either of you think that was Julie Christie at first?
I didn't. I just assumed it was connected in some way with this mysterious figure in the red coat. I didn't think it was Julie Christie, but others
didn't occur to me either. Nor I'm sorry to contradict you here, Lori, but it did not occur to me in the scaffolding crash that Sutherland was going to die then. First of all, we're in the middle of the movie and they're not going to kill off either of the major stars that early. So, it's a very unusual film that would do that. But no, this was just an anonymous woman who had probably been murdered and tossed in the canal.